Everybody cares about the economy. We care about having jobs, being able to maybe retire one day, being able to afford things like, food and a place to live and maybe having a car and having a few nice things. Everybody kind of wants that. It seems like, certainly in my lifetime, that the economy and the economic well-being of people in this country seems to be getting worse.
Want to talk about stress? Okay? I've stumbled onto a major company conspiracy, Mac. How about that for stress?
As our economy is flattening and weakening and slowing down over time, our debt is doing the opposite. It's basically just starting to go straight up, like so.
And I got a paper trail to prove it. Check this out. Take a look at this.
Jesus Christ,
That right there is the mail. Now let's talk about the mail. Can we talk about the mail, please, Mac? I'm dying to talk about the mail with you all day, okay?
And it led to me this term called quantitative easing, which is essentially the government or the central bank, which is sort of half government, half bank, can just print money and give it to banks and corporations.
Simply flooded the system with money.
Yes, we did. That's another way to think about it. We did.
Where does it come from? Do you just print it?
We print it digitally.
You've lost your mind. You've lost your mind, Charlie.
And now the conclusion.
So what is going on? And actually things get a little bit worse when we talk about a topic called inflation. So let's just give a little background on what that is. So inflation is basically, as an economy grows, generally the amount of money that represents that economy kind of grows at the same time. And that's perfectly normal and kind of acceptable. But the idea with inflation is that if the amount of money that can be either printed or lended out by banks or taken on as debt increases too fast, the cost of goods will go up over time at a rate that's disproportional to the economy growing. And so, you might have noticed your grocery bill is kind of getting more and more expensive over the last, few decades, and that is an example of inflation. Now, inflation is not a problem, like I was saying, if the economy is growing at a pace that can keep up with inflation. Because generally speaking, what happens is that, yes, the price of a good goes up. So the price of bananas or apples or meat or chicken or whatever is going up. But I'm also making more and more money, and so I can pay for that extra price increase. And if things are going well, generally speaking, I'm actually making more money than the cost of goods are increasing. And so I'm actually able to buy more and more stuff with my money. Unfortunately, that's what we call wage purchasing power. Basically, how much of a good can be bought with a wage. Unfortunately, that is not going well for America. There's a lot of talk about the minimum wage right now, and I think rightfully so. So the minimum wage is increasing over time. Starting in 1960, the minimum wage was $1. And so that doesn't sound like a bunch, but $1 used to buy you a lot more than it does today. That's inflation. In 1990, the minimum wage had increased to $3.80. Okay, hey, people are making more money, but again, is that really making more money? How does that compare to the price of goods? And then again, in 2020, the minimum wage is stuck for a long time at $7.25. I remember when I first got a job, it was like over 10 years ago, I think that was what the minimum wage was. So it really hasn't grown much at all in over 10 years, I believe. This is where you compare, okay, yes, the minimum wage is going up over time, but so is the price of other goods. Remember, inflation. So the price of bread is increasing over time. So bread purchasing power would basically be how much bread could I actually buy with the minimum wage? And so when we look at that number, we can see that in 1990, the average person making minimum wage could buy 7% less bread compared to the minimum wage in 1960. In 2020, somebody making minimum wage can buy 30% less bread today compared to somebody making minimum wage in 1960. That's a huge difference. So in other words, you're kind of having to pay 30% more for bread, And in other words, you don't have much money to spend potentially on other things. The exact same trend happens with beef and gasoline. All of those things are getting more and more expensive compared to the actual money that people are making at minimum wage. When we look at houses and education tuition, it's astonishing. It really is. Somebody making minimum wage today can pay for 92% less tuition or education compared to somebody making minimum wage in 1960. Or in other words, for that particular calculation, you're having to pay over 10 times more compared to somebody making minimum wage in 1960. The equivalent to that would be like, college tuition now for a semester can cost thousands of dollars, whereas in 1960 it would only have cost the equivalent of hundreds of dollars. It's a lot easier to save a hundred or a few $100s up to pay for your college than it is to save several thousand up. That's what we're talking about here. And so really what's happening is basically people that make minimum wage are getting shut out of paying for college. And the similar thing is happening for houses. You're pretty much having to pay double what it would have cost for a house in 1960. So people making minimum wage are getting shut out of buying houses. So I think it's clear that for people making minimum wage, things are getting worse for the things that you are buying. There are a couple of exceptions. I think you can buy more corn and more chicken. So you can look at different items and their cost over time. Those were the main ones that stood out, and televisions I think are cheaper, depending on your perspective. That is part of where inflation calculations I think go awry, but I'm not going to get into that right now. So yes, there are some things that you can buy more of, but for the things that I would say are pretty critical, things like education, housing, gasoline for your car, bread, meat, all those things you basically can pay for less currently. Okay, so that's the minimum wage. That's the bottom, the poor folks in our country. What about the people in the middle? So the middle class, that would be considered the median wage. So whoever that person is, if you line up all Americans and you put the person making the least on one end and the person making the most on one end, and you take that exact middle person, how much are they making in 1960 compared to 1990 compared to 2020? And we can see something similar. In 1960, the median wage was $2, and by 1990, that had jumped up to $12 per hour, basically. So that's how much you're making per hour. So that's a pretty big jump. I mean, you're making like what, 6 times more money? Okay, cool. And actually, when you compare that jump, that 6 times more money jump compared to the price of goods, the person making in the middle class in 1990 could actually pay for 50%, roughly 50%, 47% more bread. So now my money is actually going further to buy the goods that I want. So I can buy 50% roughly more bread compared to somebody making in the middle class in 1960. That's pretty awesome. The idea is that, I mean, you don't need to buy more bread. Maybe if you want to, you can. But the idea is that, okay, I don't have to spend as much of my wage on bread, and so I can use it on, I don't know, luxury items or houses or whatever. And this is the sign of a growing economy and good things happening. The same happens with beef and gasoline. The only one that was kind of holding steady, down by 1%, that's pretty much holding steady, was education and tuition costs. So the average person in 1960 compared to 1990 that's in the middle class, they could pay for roughly the same amount of education. You could pay for more housing, etc. So the big takeaway here is that the middle guy in 1990 was actually doing better compared to the middle guy in 1960. So that's cool. That's good. Wasn't quite true for the guy at the bottom, but at least the guy in the middle is doing better. What do we see when we compare that to 2020? We see basically the opposite happens. The person in the middle can buy actually 8% less bread, 5% less beef, 5% less gasoline compared to the middle guy in 1960. So this is not compared to 1990. So basically what we saw is that things got better for the middle class going from 1960 to 1990. That's great. But then not only did they get worse, but they got so much worse that all of the gains that they made were basically taken away, and now they're actually below where they were in 1960. So if you're in the middle class today, at the median wage, you are actually making less than the equivalent person in 1960 and way less than the equivalent person in 1990. This is unbelievably true for the things that are rising in costs like crazy, like tuition and houses. And you might be saying, well, you know, you can take out a bigger mortgage or you can take out student loans to help pay for that. But I mean, that's still, frankly, that still sucks. I mean, you're having to pay more in your lifetime, and that takes away from other things that you would want to pay for, like, I don't know, a vacation or improving a luxury item or improving your life in some way, a new hobby, et cetera, because all of your money is having to go to paying for your house or paying for your education now if you're in the middle class. So yeah, that data is not looking great. And just to kind of summarize, the idea is that if we lined up all the wages that everybody's earning in America and we look at the low end, the minimum wage, yes, it's going up, but the prices of other goods are going up at a higher rate. And so proportional, the amount of money you're making can't pay for as much of those goods. And I focused on the goods that were kind of necessities, like food, bread, beef, gasoline. You know, people need that for their cars or, you know, to ride the bus. You know, that has to do with bus costs and transportation costs, all that stuff. Houses, shelter, education, things that people need, right? All those costs are going up at a faster rate compared to the minimum wage. And that was true from 1960 to 1990, but just barely. But then from 1990 to 2020, it's gotten so much worse. And actually, this data is from 2019, so this isn't like caused by the pandemic. All this was happening before the pandemic. It's even worse now, basically. So that's bad. If we look at the guy in the middle, again, if we line up all the wages, we look at the guy in the middle, from 1960 to 1990, they effectively had more money in their pockets. Their wage went up faster than the amount, the cost of goods, so they could effectively buy more stuff with the money that they were making. That's a good thing. That means you have more money to buy things. It's generally what makes people happy.
Let's talk about the mail. Can we talk about the mail?
Except then from 1990 to 2020 or 2019, we saw a dramatic reversal of the trend. So yes, wages were going up faster than goods, but then goods went up way, way faster and wages barely went up at all. And so the guy in the middle compared to 1960 and 1990 is worse off today. It has basically less money to pay for things. Education being the worst and housing being second worst. It's hard to get data on, so we kind of looked at the guy on the low end, minimum wage, and the median wage, the guy in the middle. It's hard to get data on the high end just because jobs there are kind of inconsistent. Generally, when you make money on the high end, it's not really from a wage, it's from other stuff. Not really going to get too much into that, but it's definitely a problem. But you can think of like the highest wage earners, things like doctors and lawyers. Those you can find some wage data. And generally speaking, what you see is that from 1960 to 1990, they're doing way better. And then from 1990 to 2020, they're kind of not doing as well, actually, too. So pretty much across the board, wage earners are not making as much money compared to the things that they have to pay for. This kind of blew my mind. I kind of knew it was true because like you can just kind of feel it. Like, I don't know, there are articles out that say like millennials spend less money at restaurants than other generations, you know, people of my generation. And that's true for Gen Z too, coming after us. And then there are other articles that say millennials pay less at the grocery store compared to other generations. So we're paying less at restaurants and grocery stores. Like, pretty sure millennials just don't have any money to pay for anything. So, like, I think the average person can kind of feel this, right? I don't know why, but I never connected the dots to environmental science. I always thought, okay, this was something wrong with America. There's corruption. I don't know, something's broken with the system, whatever. If we look at similar data for the entire world, not just America, but everywhere, we kind of see a similar trend. Let's take a look. So if we look at the global trend of economic growth, we see very similar. We see this downward trend in the economic growth. So yes, economies are still growing around the world, but they're growing much slower than they used to be. And the trend is going to approach zero here within the next couple decades. And this is everywhere around the world. So surely, is it an issue with government corruption or some inequality of wealth that's happening everywhere at the same time? That seems a little fishy. And again, just so you can kind of visualize, the idea is that over time the economy is growing. If this was just a flat straight line, it would basically be growing like this, more and more and more each year. When the line is decreasing, what is happening is basically it was growing really, really fast like this, and then now it is beginning to slow down and level off. And if it gets to zero, basically it's flat. If it gets below zero, then it's actually decreasing the overall economy. And when we talk about what does that mean, that means the overall number of products and goods and services that we are producing and purchasing. The thing that connected all the dots for me was looking at the exact same trend happen with fossil fuel consumption. So this is nothing to do with the economy. This is just how many, this is the growth of fossil fuel consumption over time. So what we're seeing here is pretty much the exact same trend. In the 60s and 70s, it was growing super fast. That would represent, so we're getting more and more and more fossil fuels each year. And then over time, the percentage growth is decreasing and approaching zero, and maybe even going to go to the negative. And the idea is that it's trailing off like so. So it's almost a perfect relationship between economic growth and fossil fuel growth. And so if fossil fuels, consuming fossil fuels is good for the economy, why are we consuming less and less fossil fuels each year at a slower and slower rate? Is it because we're trying to help the environment? No, I mean, hardly anybody actually cares about the environment, and there's hardly any environmental laws in place that would limit the number of fossil fuels that countries, this is global trends. There's nothing in place around the globe to limit fossil fuel consumption in this manner, and for a trend that's gone on for decades upon decades. I mean, back in the 80s and 90s, we didn't know anything about global warming. I mean, we did, but it wasn't really in the public eye. So this trend is going down and down. It's not for environmental reasons. It's not because we were trying to save the planet by burning less fossil fuel. The really obvious answer is fossil fuels are non-renewable resources. We've said that. Everybody on planet Earth knows that. We know that that means that they will run out one day. So if you have to imagine, what is it going to look like when a fossil fuel runs out? It's going to look like this. This is exactly what you would expect the trend to look like. If one day we're going to run out of fossil fuels, we're consuming more and more and more, we begin running out, so we have to consume less and less and less, and then eventually less and less and less to the point where we're actually using less and less each year. The problem is that it seems like the economy is tracking the same pattern, which made me kind of come up with this sort of epiphany this year. When we think about money and wealth and the economy and all that stuff, is it all just really energy resources? Is it all just based off of fossil fuels? And yeah, I think it might just be. This is the economics that you're not going to be taught in economics class, basically. There is a school of thought, and it's generally not followed by most economists, because I think it's a very hard truth that they don't really want to acknowledge. But basically, the idea is that the entire economy is just an energy dynamic. And what that means is that all aspects of the economy, transportation, trade, construction, agriculture, finance, industry, manufacturing, everything that you can think of that we do in the economy for jobs, it all requires energy and energy resources. And so as we say that the economy is getting bigger and bigger and bigger over time throughout human history, particularly the last century, what we're really saying is that we're consuming more and more energy, which lets us do more and more stuff. So pretty much the entirety of our economic progress can be viewed in terms of using new energy resources like coal, oil, and gas that we didn't used to use, and basically figuring out ways to use those energy resources more and more efficiently. If that's not really making sense to you, this is kind of a way that we can visualize the economy. So on our left, we have our energy resources and our power plants, basically our oil, gas, coal, and we're using that to make electricity and gasoline, and that pretty much powers everything that is being produced by the economy. Electricity, manufacturing, even things like, okay, if we're going to make steel and we're going to use steel in our cars, well, that's technically also a resource that would go on the left. And to make steel, you have to melt rock and melt out iron and then mix it with carbon, usually in coal, and all this heat, and that's how we make steel. So there is no steel without tons and tons of energy. You're driving your car, that's using gasoline. We're using boats to move, and planes and trains and all that stuff to move all kinds of goods all around the world. We're growing food that requires tractors and fertilizer, all that's made with energy and runoff energy. Everything that you're mining to use as resources to build all of our stuff, that needs energy. Anything that you're constructing or lumber that you're cutting down, all of that stuff requires energy. And so everything that we think of as the economy, which is kind of on the far right side, are things that we use every day, our cell phones, our computers, our cars, everything, all the stores we go to, the grocery store, all the food that we see there, our Amazon packages being delivered, none of that is possible without energy resources. And it's kind of like a big aha and a big, well, yeah, no kidding moment that if we run out of the things on the left, we can't do the things in the middle, and we won't have the things on the right. And as we run out of things on the left, it's probably going to be poor people first that get impacted the most, and then followed by the middle class, and then followed by the rich people last. And that also seems to be the trend that is occurring. It's kind of weird. I knew all this stuff already, but I never put it together. Usually when they're talking about non-renewable resources running out, something like oil or coal or gas, it's like, oh, that's something that's going to happen, I don't know, 100 years from now or something. Like, we got lots of it left. That's not really true. Yes, there is lots of it out there, but there are dynamics at play that basically the more we use of it, the harder it is for us to find it and get it out of the earth. And the harder it is for us to find it and get it out of the earth, the more expensive it is. The more expensive it gets, the more expensive everything gets in our economy, and the less we can buy stuff. And
You've lost your mind.
It is strange because I have talked about subjects like this before, and I'm going to continue talking about a couple more things here, where once you kind of see that picture that emerges, it's painfully obvious, and it's like, how did I miss this before? How did I never think of it this way? So let's talk about some familiar concepts that lots of people talk about with environmental science and non-renewable resources, which is the topic of peak oil. So let me introduce that topic to you, and then once you see, oh yeah, I'm familiar with peak oil, once you start thinking about what it means and that there's evidence of it happening pretty much all over the place, let's take a look. All right, so yeah, the idea with peak oil is usually people say we have something like 50 to 100 years of oil left. And the general idea is that over time, as economies are growing and human populations are growing, you're using more and more oil. So you're digging up more and more oil out of the ground. You're using more and more and more and more of it. But then you get to a point where you begin running out of it, and you can't keep using more and more because you can't find more and more. And it peaks, and then you continue trying to use it, or you replace it with something else, and then it declines. That's the idea with peak oil. People have been talking about it for decades, I think since the 60s and 70s. Again, oil is a non-renewable resource. We knew it was going to run out one day, so people have been talking about, hey, what's it going to look like when it runs out? And what is that going to look like for the world? When you're on this upswing of peak oil, the idea is that oil is really, really abundant and easy to find, and we're harvesting it like crazy and using it like crazy. And because of that, oil is very plentiful, but it's also cheap. It's easy to find. As we begin running out, basically all of the easy to find oil is sucked up immediately, and then we have to keep drilling deeper and deeper and looking for it, and harder to find places until all those places are exhausted, and then we have to keep going deeper and deeper and deeper into the earth trying to find the oil somewhere else. And as we keep doing that more and more, it just gets super expensive in this period that it kind of forces people to not use it anymore. People just can't afford to use it anymore. And that is when basically oil becomes scarce and expensive. That's on the backswing of this graph. So I never really thought about it, but basically the time where the problems really begin to emerge is somewhere in this region, where you were using more and more and more of it, but then you start hitting limits. And as you start hitting limits, the rate of growth of that resource begins diminishing and getting slower and slower and slower. And at that point, that means that you're running out of oil. It's harder and harder to find, and it's getting more and more expensive. People can't afford it. The economy's slowing down. And then after that is either a graceful transition to some kind of other energy resource, or we're in trouble kind of situation. And we'll talk about that more. If you're having trouble kind of visualizing that, we can take you back to the early days of oil exploration. There's a movie called There Will Be Blood. It's a very strange movie, but it does show some of these early days of oil exploration for you, I think in the early 1900s, on this upswing part where oil is super easy to find and it's super cheap. So let's take a look at what oil wells and oil harvesting looked like back then. So yeah, that's a pretty far cry from what modern oil wells and extraction look like. I mean, people literally with shovels could dig a big enough hole to find oil and then just scoop it out with buckets by the barrel. And so a crew of a few hundred, not even that, a few dozen guys could harvest lots and lots of oil by just digging a hole in the ground. That's how easy and plentiful it was and how cheap it was. Cut to today, where now we are completely, I mean, the idea that you could only drill down a few, 20, 30 feet and strike oil, I mean, that's not happening pretty much anywhere in the world today. I'll give you perspective. The Deepwater Horizon, the oil rig that famously blew up in the Gulf of Mexico, I don't know, 10 or so years ago, that oil rig was floating in about a mile deep of water. So it's actually a floating rig floating in the water, about a mile deep of water, and then it's drilling down another 3.5 or 4 miles deep into the Earth's surface. Some of that line has to go down kind of horizontally as a relief valve. So we went from a time where oil was so easy to get out of the ground that a few dudes could dig it up with shovels and buckets and could sell it very, very cheaply, and it was widely available, to now it's so scarce that we're having to look out deep, deep into the ocean, mile deep water, and then drill another 3 or 4 miles deep into the crust of the Earth to actually find the oil anymore. Obviously, it's much harder and much more expensive to do this compared to the olden days. And so when companies drill oil this way, they have to sell the oil at a higher cost. If everything in the economy runs off of oil, that means that everything in the economy costs more, and the average person can purchase less and less over time, and that basically will destroy the economy. It's so obvious. So the question is, are we really at this peak? Are we really in this transitionary period where the amount of oil we're using is slowing down, prices are getting more and more expensive, and this is actually the root cause of our economic troubles? Well, let's see some more data. Oil has actually still been trending up in the last couple of decades, the amount of oil that we're producing. However, it is trending up slower and slower. So back in the 60s and 70s, we can see it was kind of going straight up. The downturn here was actually political. It didn't have anything to do with the environment. That was the Iranian Revolution, where basically Iran, a country with lots and lots of oil, kind of shut itself off from the rest of the world. And so we saw this big downtick of oil production. Then it picked up again. So, but you can see it's at a much, much slower rate now. And lately, it's starting to kind of flatten more and more, depending on where you are in the world. So not quite the exact same curve here. We had some ups and downs, but it definitely doesn't appear to be going straight up anymore like it was in the 60s and 70s. It does seem to be flattening out. And part of that is actually something called fracking. This is a new technology. And so this is a new technology of acquiring oil. This is oil production in the United States, and we can kind of see that it basically fit the perfect peak oil curve, roughly, where it was going up and up and up, and then it peaked, and then now it's going back down. But we can see there's been this secondary explosion out the wazoo with something called fracking. And that happened in about 2005 to 2008 during the financial crisis and after it. So that's kind of peculiar. That kind of goes against the idea of the peak oil. If we have a peak and then we find a new way to find more oil, and then we get another peak, that's kind of, okay, peak oil is nonsense. That's what a lot of people say. Well, kind of, sort of. Let's talk about the second part of the oil equation. The idea is that as we're going up and up and up more and more, we'll get to a point where it becomes getting more and more expensive as we begin running out. So yes, it will continue going up for a while, but it will be getting more expensive in the process. So let's look at oil prices over the time period. This is the historic oil prices for the last like 40 years. When oil first started becoming a thing, it was pretty expensive because people didn't really know how to process it, and processing it was pretty expensive. But then once people figured out how to dig it up and process it, it was super cheap, $20 a barrel. And then it continued to actually get lower and lower until even into the 50s and 60s. We can see we got down to almost like $15 to $10 a barrel. And then America started running out of oil, and there were these issues in the Middle East, and we can see the price of oil went super, super high. And it came back once those issues kind of resolved, and we got oil drilling in different parts of the world. It kind of stabilized, but it's still at a much higher level compared to how it was for the last 60 years. And then during the next few years, decades, we see it started going up again. And right now, I think we're at about $65 a barrel today. And so basically what we can kind of see is that we had this long trend downward in terms of the price of oil. And now we have this massive trend kind of upward where it's getting, this is dollars over here on the right. This is how expensive oil is. It's getting more and more expensive, basically. And the good old days where it's going to get back down to here, actually briefly got here during the pandemic because nobody was buying oil because nobody was going to work. But that didn't last very long. The idea that it's going to come back down to this at a stable point, down to this level, again, it's not happening. Oil is going to continue to get more and more expensive. So yes, we are fracking and we are producing more oil. So technically we haven't hit a peak yet, but the things that you would expect to happen as you're approaching the peak are happening. Oil is getting more and more expensive over time. It's not a perfect upward trajectory, but yes, we have crazy blips as we're running out of more and more oil. We're getting more and more expensive. And this is all inflation adjusted. So this is the kind of true value of it. So why that is, okay, hey, if we're continuing to find more and more oil, why is it getting so expensive? We have more and more of it. Shouldn't the price be okay? The idea is there are two main types of drilling for oil, what we call conventional and non-conventional. Conventional is you basically drill a hole in the ground and oil comes shooting out of the hole. Oil, as a reminder, is algae and bacteria from the ocean that has gotten trapped down in rocks and is being cooked over time, and that's what turns it into oil. As it's being cooked over time in the rock, some of it will bubble out and will make these nice little pockets of oil called an oil and gas reservoir. And when you drill into that, basically oil comes out very, very smoothly. In the olden days, these pockets and reservoirs were really close to the surface. There were lots of them, and you didn't have to dig that deep of a hole to get to the oil. As we sucked all that out, we are having to go deeper and deeper and deeper. Okay, and then now we're getting to the point where there is no more pockets of oil anywhere else. So we're having to do what's called unconventional or non-conventional oil extraction. And another word for that is fracking. And so basically, instead of waiting for the earth to kind of cook this rock that has the algae in it and patiently waiting for it to kind of bubble up into a nice reservoir, well, we ain't got that option anymore. So what we do is we drill into this rock that has this dead algae in it, and we push a bunch of water and crap down into it to the point where we actually crack it and fracture it. That's why it's called fracking. And then after it's all cracked up and fractured, we suck out all of the juice, and then we have to separate it all and refine it. Clearly, that is much harder and more expensive. So yes, we have oil still, but our method to do it is more expensive than it used to be. And so what's happening is, yes, we have fracking, but it's not actually helping us get cheap oil again. It's getting more and more expensive. So again, coming back to that picture of the economy, if this is getting more and more expensive and costing more and more dollars, all of this stuff is costing more and more dollars. All of this stuff is costing more and more dollars, and people can't afford to buy things anymore. And the entire basis of an economy can't really keep up with the growth that's expected of it. So all of this relates to our kind of final concept that I want to address, and it's something called the energy cost of energy. So if we want to use an energy resource, whether it's oil or gas or coal or even something like wind or solar, we have to invest some money and energy to get that resource. In the old days, let's say we're trying to get oil back in the early 1900s, the only energy that we had to expend was we had to dig a hole in the ground and start scooping out oil, basically. That is super easy. I mean, it takes hardly any energy putting in compared to the amount of energy that you're getting out from the oil that you're scooping out of the ground. Nowadays, maybe up until the 50s and 60s, yeah, we couldn't just dig a simple hole and scoop it out. We had to drill a bigger hole, which means we needed a bigger drill, like this one. But potentially we were going to hit a bigger pocket of oil and everything was still working out great. Now we're getting to a point where we are having to drill so deep, or we're having to rely on fracturing the rock itself down there, and then having to clean up this big mess that we're making, or we're having to use oil rigs that are floating in miles of deep of water that are hundreds of miles offshore and drilling miles upon miles upon miles deep into the Earth's crust to get to the sweet, juicy oil. We can see that we're having to put a lot more energy in to get the oil out. So basically there's a school of thought in economics that the surplus energy that we can get from our energy resources is actually what we can use in our economy. So let's imagine we have an oil company, and let's imagine it's 70 years ago. And so you have to put a little bit of energy to run your oil drill, to make all this stuff, to make all the steel, and to pay all your workers and all that stuff. You need a certain amount of energy to get all that going. And you drill your hole and you unlock, let's say you put 1 barrel of oil in and you get 100 barrels out for every 1 barrel that you put in. That's awesome, because now we have 99 barrels of oil to sell to people and 99 barrels of cheap oil that we can run our entire economy off of. Okay, let's flash forward nowadays. Now we have to, let's say we're having to do some deep water drilling rig. So we had to build some oil rig that can float out into the ocean. That costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of resources. We have to employ a crew that lives out on this thing. That costs a lot of money and a lot of resources. We have to have some kind of boat that takes it to and from shore. And again, we're having to go way, way far, way, way deep out in the ocean to find oil now. So that takes even more energy and more resources to transport it. So now we're having to put, 10 barrels of oil in, and instead of getting 99 out, we're only getting 90 equivalent. That's our net. So now we only have 90 barrels of oil to sell to the economy. We have to sell that because we have to put so much more cost in. We have to sell that for more. And there's only 90 barrels of oil to do everything instead of 99, and the economy is going to suffer. And as we go further, okay, now we're getting to a point where we have to do, 20 barrels of oil. Okay, now we only have 80 barrels to give to the economy, and so on and so forth. And over time, what happens is basically we just have less and less energy to run everything in the economy because our energy resources are less and less efficient. So in other words, over time, the surplus energy that we've actually used to run all of our economy off of has basically shrunk, and our economic growth is shrunk with it. So the big question is, can we transition to another kind of energy resource and run everything in the economy off of, say, solar panels and wind and biofuels? So we're running out of oil, we need to do something else. We want to keep growing the economy, we want to keep providing jobs, we want to keep having people retire and be able to purchase things. Can we do it all with renewables, basically? And do it in a way that is somehow more efficient and cheap than it was to do it with oil currently and also back in the day? I'd say the honest answer is no. Some of these things, I'm not even sure how we would make them. Fertilizer is generally made using natural gas and a whole bunch of heat energy. You could technically do it with electricity, but I don't know of anybody that is doing it now with electricity. I read an article, basically they were claiming they were making fertilizer using wind energy and electricity from wind to separate hydrogen from water, and using hydrogen and nitrogen to make fertilizer. The crucial step they left out was the enormous amount of heat that's required for that reaction that is almost always provided by fossil fuels. I mean, you could do it with like an electric stove kind of condition, but maybe you could do it with a biofuel or something. I can't imagine it would be cheaper than using non-renewable resources. You know, you can go back and watch my renewable energy video explaining how much space and time you need for that, and how you need batteries to make up for the when it's not sunny or windy outside. It's possible, but it's hard to me imagine how the economy could run as efficiently as it had in the 60s and 70s and 80s, when things seemed to be getting better for everybody off of renewable resources. So how is this supposed to work then? I actually had a tough time thinking of, should I even make this video? Actually, it was kind of a similar conundrum I had in the early days of COVID, where I was like, I want to teach my class about what's going to happen with this pandemic, and how it probably is going to last several years. And it's not going to be like, hey, you're just going to go away for spring break and then we're all coming back to school. Like I was saying goodbye to them. And that was kind of a tough thing to teach about, because it's like, I don't like to bum people out. But, you know, this is kind of a bummer. I don't think there's any grand conspiracy at play. I think people just, there's a lot of wishful thinking that somehow the economy is going to magically turn around and everything's going to be wonderful again. If we only print so much money and take on so much debt, it'll all get better somehow. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of what an economy is and how an economy works, and how it pretty much all requires energy and energy resources. When you start factoring in that, it's pretty plainly obvious what's happening. Why it seems like the economy is getting worse. It's because, we have been entirely dependent on non-renewable resources, and we're running out of those non-renewable resources, and our economy can't run as well as it used to. Now, I don't want to be all doom and gloom. I do want to kind of offer a interesting positive note. I was thinking a lot about energy resources, and I was thinking about how back a long time ago, I was talking about the progression of humanity over time, how we went from cavemen to farming to the Industrial Revolution, where we were harvesting fossil fuels to fuel our growth. I started thinking about how I focused on the transition from caveman to farming. The important thing was farming, because it gave us enough food to grow our human population. We had enough food to actually feed everybody, instead of having to like try to hunt animals in the woods. That's really hard to do. I didn't really talk too much about domestication, and I realized how important that was recently as an energy resource. When you talk about growing a human population, and particularly a city, the idea is that as you're packing people into a city, it's getting so dense that they can't all have farms and they can't all grow their own food. And so they're relying on food being grown outside of the city being brought into the city. Historically, that work was impossible until the arrival of the horse. And so that a horse is actually kind of a remarkable use of an energy resource. Horses basically eat grass. You can just let them go in a field and they grow up big, and then you can use them to haul your cart full of food into the city to sell it and generate all this economic growth. So the horse was kind of like a proto, car in a sense. I mean, in terms of humanity figuring out how to harness a resource, grass, to do a lot of work for itself. And that got me thinking that probably a huge chunk of economic growth and the growth of cities and that sort of thing was all driven by, this innovation of transportation and this use of a horse. And that it probably would have been impossible without the horse. So even if you had farms, you probably couldn't have a big city without horses bringing food from the farms to the city. And then I was kind of reading up on some history, and I thought, wait a minute, I know the Aztecs had some of the largest cities. I know the Aztec capital was like at one point one of the largest cities in the world, and this was prior to the Europeans coming over to see the Aztecs. And the Aztecs had not domesticated the horse. So there were no horses in North America or South America until the Europeans came and colonized them. So how did the Aztecs build such a big city without horses, without that energy resource? Shouldn't that be kind of impossible? Let's look at how Aztecs built their city, their biggest capital city that housed apparently hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. So this was, pardon me if I say the word wrong, I think it's Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. This is what historians think it looked like. And it was actually built in a kind of swampy area of a lake. And the way it worked is actually the entire city was a system of canals. And this massive city had plentiful water from the lake, and they actually woven throughout the city was actually farms and farmland and crops. And instead of using a horse to move goods around and food around, they use boats, which are, if you imagine how much weight you can put on a boat and then paddle it around compared to how much, weight you can carry in a backpack. I mean, you can load up a boat way heavier than you can load up a backpack and carry it around and use way less energy in the process. So the Aztecs managed to build up this massive economy and this massive city while using simultaneously less energy and actually completely without the energy resource of the horse that I thought was crucial to allowing a city to build in the first place. I think if there's a path forward for humanity, it's something along these same lines. We have lots of resources and technology already, and maybe we can begin transitioning to a world where instead of everybody wanting iPhones and cars and trying to make the most money, we transition to a world kind of like the Aztecs, where we're more self-reliant and non-dependent on this massive economy and this massive global trade network, where most of our food is grown locally nearby, and we don't have people, driving hours from the suburbs to the city to work their job and drive back so that they can, buy the new iPhone and all that stuff. I mean, maybe there is a vision of the future where we actually can use considerably less energy, still live happy, productive lives, but with a smaller and more shrunken economy at the same time. This particular genre of fiction is called solar punk, if you're interested in looking into it. I think it's an interesting idea. I'm not sure if the average person could actually embrace it or not, but it is an interesting idea, and that will be kind of the last thing that I leave you. This would be the idea of kind of voluntary degrowth. So instead of everybody wanting more and more and more, we kind of look around and say, hey, what can we do with less?